get right in. I have a friend with me, Kristen Watson, sorry, and she's going to be managing the chat for me. So feel free, either unmute or ask any questions in the chat, and she'll help weave them in throughout the presentation. So we're just going to get started. I'm going to share my screen. Sorry, it's taken a minute. It doesn't want to let me share my screen, which is very unfortunate. Kristen, can you share your screen?
It's turned on, so it should be available to you.
Okay, let's try it one more time. And it's not. Is it available to Kristen as well?
It's actually available to all participants.
Kristen, can you share your screen?
I'm trying.
Here's what I'm going to do while we're waiting. I'm going to share the slide deck with everybody.
If it won't pop up for either of you, once you share the link, I can grab the slide deck and present from my end.
That would be fantastic.
I don't know what's wrong in our office.
Right. Can you do it? Can you grab that link and share?
Let me get it situated. You know, once you
Sorry.
click on a link, you have to like start rearranging your tabs and
I just need to be able to share videos when you go to share screen. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, everybody.
That's always fun.
Right. So what I'm going to tell you while we're waiting to figure out the technical difficulties, you do all have access to the PowerPoint. And what this is going to be kind of an overview of inclusive practices. I know it originally said that I was with the department with APSRC, but I am now back with the Department of Education. My name is Tabitha Riendo. Can you go back one slide, please? My name is Tabitha Riendo, and I work in the Arkansas Department of Education, the Special Education Unit. And this is kind of just a brief overview. Last year, we went and did a big, long presentation on the why. And right now, we're currently in the middle of going through a presentation on the how. And this is kind of a collaboration, a merge of those two presentations, just an overview. And you'll have the opportunity to see where we're doing the full day training throughout the fall. So if it's something you'd want more information on, you'll have the opportunity to find that out and come into it this fall. Okay, next slide, please. So I just want to start with the vision and mission statement at the department. And the vision statement, yeah, I'm not going to read it, you have it there, but I'd like to bring your attention to the bold words, student-focused inclusive education. And really, we at the department, at the special education unit, kind of inserted that word inclusive into our vision statement because we really truly believe that this is the direction that in Arkansas we need to take our schools and do what's best for students. Then the vision statement, you'll see that that word bold, every is in bold. And that's because the number one question we get when we're giving these presentations is, do you mean every? Do you really mean every student? Do you mean that student with the most significant cognitive disabilities, the student with whatever? And really the answer is truly, yes, we do. We mean every, each, and all. Now, is that going to look exactly the same for each student? Absolutely not. But if we can just take a student from where they are and just be a little more inclusive, then we're moving the needle for all students. Next slide, please. So our desired outcomes, go ahead and do 3 clicks. Our desired outcomes for Arkansas is the fact that we're going to lead the nation in student-focused inclusive education. We're going to allow all students to be considered general education students first. And then that last bullet, I'm very, very passionate about. We need to take down the silos that we currently work in. We want to have general education and special education to operate in one system instead of 2 separate silos. Next slide, and you can do 4 clicks, please. 5 clicks. So today we're going to hopefully by the end of this hour and a half, 2 hours, participants will see that we must do things differently in order to have different outcomes. We can't keep on doing the same thing and expect to have different outcomes. We're going to work with universal design for learning and high leverage practices just a little bit. And then we're going to focus on supports that a student with an IEP needs instead of minutes or a bell schedule. And we're going to do that by going over some scenarios. Now we're going to start kind of just the background of this presentation by watching this video, and it's called What is Inclusion? And it's going to give us 3 different scenarios, and we'll end with the one that truly is most inclusive. Yes, please. There should be volume playing.
That's my fault because I was muted. You couldn't hear anything.
Oh, that's fine. That's why we have closed captioning.
I don't understand why I'm at the back of the class. I wish I was like everyone else. I want to do what they're doing. But here I am doing the same old number activity, watching as my classmates learn something else. Don't they know that they're setting me up to fail? Don't they know they hold my future in their hands? I want to work with my class, learn what they are learning, and do the activities they do. But here I am, stuck at the back, limited by low expectations. Having a one-on-one teacher aide just teaches me to rely on them and means I get less attention from the teacher. I am not included in the classroom. I am in the same room but segregated from my peers, sat to the side or back, working on different things and missing out. I want to be free to learn with my peers, reach my full potential, and be seen to be like everyone else. I need something to change. You may be wondering what was wrong with this picture. I am in the classroom with my peers, sitting in my seat, learning the same things as everyone else. You may think this is inclusion, but it's not. I am stifled, limited, and held back from reaching my full potential. Though I love my teacher aide, I don't get to think for myself. In fact, a lot of the time, my teacher aide does it for me, even whispering the answer in my ear when I already know it. The more she is with me, the more I realize that there is no point in me thinking for myself because she will give me the answer anyway. I'm sure there are other kids who also need her help. Does she need to be with me? Can't she help others? Surely if I need help, I can put my hand up and ask my teacher like my friends do. My friends and classmates want to help me, but by having someone right next to me, they can't. I need to learn from my peers, be able to do group work and be challenged. I want to be allowed to fail or succeed and learn from it. I need something to change. Can you find me in the crowd? Inclusion is more than just a word. It is a culture, a mindset, and an expectation that everyone can and will learn and succeed along their age-appropriate peers. I know it can be challenging to include me in the learning, as sometimes I might require extra resources and information. But giving me space to learn from my teacher and peers is the best way to challenge me and allow me to grow. I want to learn the same things as my classmates, and I want teachers to have the same expectations of me as my friends. My learning may need to be modified, but I still want the opportunity to show what I can do, not focus on what I can't. Treat me the same as any other student and watch me flourish. I will rise to the challenge of expectations you set for me. Are you ready to really include me?
All right. So I love that video for several reasons. One, I love that it's a student who has pretty significant disabilities. And in the end, we can see that she is truly in an inclusive environment. The other thing that I really love about that video is it really kind of shows the 3 different stages of what perceived inclusion is, integration, and then finally true inclusion. Because when I was teaching in the classroom, a lot of times my students would just kind of be set at the table in the back of the room, and we said we were doing inclusion, but that really wasn't inclusion. So next slide, please. So when we think about inclusion, inclusive education, we really think that it starts with these 4 essential questions. In your districts, if you have collaborative teams, you may call them collaborative teams, you may call them PLCs, whatever those collaborative teams are. But oftentimes the starting point for those collaborative teams are identifying your essential standards. Which of your standards are essential? And to do that, we need to first identify, what do we want all students to know and be able to do? And that truly is that question, next slide, please, of identifying the essential standards, because we know that teaching every student to every standard to mastery, I think Marzano says that it would take like 28 years to do that. So districts, and 2 clicks, please. So districts oftentimes identify essential standards. And if we think about those essential standards as the fence posts, those things in the middle that are the strong, solid fence posts, they're concrete cemented into the ground. They're the strong thing that holds everything else up. Those are the ones that we cannot do without. But the supporting standards, those are kind of the nice to knows. Now, believe me, our fence will not be as strong if we're missing some of those supporting standards, but our fence is still going to stand. So for us, the analogy helps to understand our essential standards are those fence posts, the ones that we cannot do without. And then the supporting standards are going to be the fence rails that, you know what, if we miss 1 or 2, we're still going to be okay. We're not going to be as solid, but we're still going to be okay. Next slide, please. So of the 4 questions, we believe that special education really lives in that 3rd question. How will we respond when some students do not learn? That's kind of the world of RTI and of special education. And that's going to be where we focus the rest of our attention today. Next slide, please. So we're going to review a little bit about the why. Like, why does inclusion matter? Why are we doing this? Why is this push happening in Arkansas and really nationally right now? Next slide, please. So this is Arkansas data, and it's eligibility data across all eligibility categories. You'll notice that there's that first category of SLD, or specific learning disability. 30% of students with IEPs are eligible under that eligibility category. Now, when we think of specific learning disability, we don't think of students with cognitive deficits. It's actually in the definition of SL, specific learning disability, that they would not have a significant cognitive deficit. So then if we go to speech, when we think about students who qualify for speech only, and we think about the elementary grades, what kind of deficit do we think typically, and you guys can put in the chat if you want, what kind of deficit do we typically think students who are speech only have in the younger grades? Articulation. Thank you. Thank you so very much for that. So if we're thinking about articulation, do we typically think of students with cognitive deficits? If speech is their only, if they're a speech only, when we think about having a receptive, an articulation deficit, we don't think of a student who has a cognitive disability. So now we're up to about 55% of students in Arkansas. And then you add that third category, OHI, or other health impairment. What do we usually think of when we think of OHI? What disability? Perfect. ADHD, absolutely. And when we think about students with ADHD, if that is their eligibility category, again, I don't often think of students with ADHD as having a significant cognitive deficit. So let's look at that. The last category that we're going to highlight, ID. That's 12%. Now, I will have you know, does anybody know what the national rate for students with intellectual disability is? Any guesses? 3%? Okay, good guess. Anybody else? Okay, the national rate, great job, Stephanie. The national rate, and thank you, Serena. The national rate for students with ID is 6%, and in Arkansas, we're 12%. So there's got to be a reason why Arkansas has double the rate of students eligible for IEPs under the eligibility category of ID. We don't have that many students that are above the national rate. So what's happening in Arkansas that we are identifying that many students in ID? Do any of you have students in your districts who live in poverty? I'm expecting to see a bunch of yeses in here, right? Because I bet you every single one of you is raising your hand right now. And when students live in most of my school, when students live in poverty, what are some of the things that they lack when they come to school? Vocabulary, absolutely. What else? Background knowledge, life experience, social skills, absolutely, all of those things. And yet when they come to school and we refer them for special education, we give them evaluations that are heavy in language. Well, we've just identified that they already have a deficit in language and background knowledge and all of those things. And yet that's the tool that we use to evaluate them. So that's something at the state level that we're kind of digging into to see why are we really double the national rate. But if we look at those first three categories, SLD, speech, and OHI, and we combine them, we can see that the majority of our students in Arkansas who are eligible for our special education services do not have cognitive deficits, yet we continually remove them from core instruction in their general education classrooms. Why do we do that? Why are we lowering that expectation for them? Next slide, please. So there are two federal laws that are also driving this movement, Essa and IDEA. And if you go to the next slide, we're going to look at Essa first. So you can see here that Essa defines a regular diploma as a standard high school diploma awarded to the preponderance of students in a state that is fully aligned with the state standards. So we wanted to know, what does fully aligned really look like? So the first thing we did is we looked at the Arkansas graduation requirements. Next slide, please. And this, we're looking specifically for math. So the graduation requirements in Arkansas for math is Algebra 1, Geometry, and then 2 other ADE approved mathematics courses. So we wanted to see, well, what does that look like? What's an approved mathematics course? Next slide, please. So we went to the Algebra 1 content standards because we're like, okay, that's what they are, but what does it say about course codes and who can teach those classes? So another click, please. And you'll see that the course code says it gives a course code, and then teacher licensure to see who can teach those classes says, please refer to course code management system. So we dug deeper and went there. Next slide. And this is what you see when it gives you teacher licensure codes for who could teach Algebra 1. What's missing? SPED, exactly, Amy. There are no SPED licensure codes here. Next slide, please. So as far as being in alignment with Essa and Arkansas graduation requirements, first of all, there's no licensure for special education teachers. And then we want to look at the Arkansas approved codes. So there's no licensure for teachers, but the other thing is special education codes that have course codes that start with a 9, they are not credit bearing within the Arkansas course code management system. Your superintendent has to go in and allow that to be. And we as a state have said that's okay if that instruction that's happening in that special education class taught by that special education teacher is aligned to grade level standards. But that is not, although we're allowing it to happen right now, that is not in alignment with Essa. Next slide, please. So what about IDEA? Go ahead, next slide. I want to give you a moment to read this slide, and in the chat box, just kind of put what phrases stick out to you as surprise you in this text. Does anything stick out to you? Alternate placements and support. Okay, anybody else? Thanks, Amy. Can you go to the next slide, please? So for us, it says that a continuum is required. And this is really important because when all this stuff started happening, all this inclusive work started happening, social media kind of went a little bit crazy and saying that Arkansas was doing away with resource room and all of these kinds of other things. But then somebody had put on there, well, they can't because IDEA says that it requires a continuum. And absolutely it does. Right here it says a continuum is required. But as people are putting in the chat, notice it says instruction in regular classes and special classes. Now in Arkansas, we usually call those special classes like self-contained courses. Then you'll notice that bottom paragraph, it says make provision for supplementary services such as resource room to be provided in conjunction with regular class placement. I have to tell you, I had never noticed that before. So this says in IDEA itself that resource room is meant to be a supplementary service provided in conjunction with regular class placement. Next slide. And 2 clicks, please. So what we think about when we're here is when we were teaching, sorry about that, when we were teaching resource room and providing core instruction, it kind of looks like this first classroom. I've got all my kiddos and I'm providing core ELA instruction, but really what it should look like is more of a, one more clip, please, more of a therapy model. Think about your speech therapy. What they do is they pull students together based on skill deficit. They're not taking their Arctic kids and putting it with their language-based kids or the whatever. They're saying these are our articulation kids and they struggle in this specific sound. We're going to group them together. We're going to work on it. They provide a service. So what if we thought about or reimagined special education as exactly that, as providing a supplementary service instead of core instruction? Next slide. One of the kind of hurdles in the way of doing that is that we as a state kind of have a blended view of accommodations and modifications. And that's actually sort of the state's fault from what I've heard. Before I moved here, we used to have paperwork, and the IEP paperwork used to say the mods page, but it wasn't really modifications on that page. They were accommodations. So we have this overlapping understanding of these terms when really they're two separate things. Accommodations are put in place to help students reach grade level standards. The expectation stays the same, and we put accommodations in place to help the student reach that expectation. Modifications, on the other hand, change the grade level expectation. Now, if you're thinking about AP classes, it raises that grade level expectation. But if you're thinking in the world of special education, it lowers that grade level standard. And whenever we lower grade level expectations, what does it do to the learning gap? It absolutely does increase it. So it's not that modifications are not necessary. There's absolutely times when it is, and we're going to look at a little video in a minute that will show it. But we have to be really mindful of when we're using modifications, because when we do, in this case, we are absolutely widening that learning gap. Next slide, please. Now, many of you may have seen this timeline. It's a proposed timeline of when this change is going to happen and what that looks like. So you'll notice that 2021-22 was the building awareness. We went around all last year and did statewide trainings. This year, 22-23, is a transition year, and schools are asked to make plans for moving forward. Again, we're still going around training. We're training more on the how, but what is your plan as a school district? This is the time that we would propose that you work on that. And then starting in 23-24, it's proposed, it's recommended that students receive core instruction in general education courses starting at 6th grade and lower. And then each year thereafter, it rolls up one grade level until we get to 2026, 2027, where in order to earn credits on the regular pathway, 9th graders must have licensed content teachers. Now, why do you think that we kind of put this rolling timeline in place instead of just saying next year 9th graders will have to have this? What's the benefit of the rolling timeline? Absolutely, Terry. Amy, you both are absolutely right. So for the kiddos, it allows for that skill development and having access to that grade level content, because you can't just put them in 9th grade Algebra 1 when they've never had grade level content taught to them. In some cases, in other cases, special education teachers do a phenomenal job and do align their grade level, their coursework to grade level expectation. Don't think that we're not saying that. But in this case, this is staying in that classroom, because not only if they're in their general education classroom, do they learn from their general education teacher, but who else do they learn from? Absolutely, their peers. That is so vital. And if you look at Hattie's research, learning from their peers has an extremely high effect size, according to John Hattie. So we are going to roll it up, and again, we get it 2026, and in order to earn credits on the regular pathway, 9th grade students have licensed content teachers, and we'll talk about that some more in a moment. Next slide, please. So that was a really quick kind of rundown of the why. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the how. And I just do want to preface this by saying the how is a full 6.5 hour training, and nobody wants to be here for 6.5 hours right now. So at the very end, I'll give you that schedule. If it's something you want to learn more information about, you'll see if it's coming. Well, it will be coming to a co-op near you. All right, next slide, please. So when we first started doing this presentation about the how, we had these 3 terms: inclusive education, inclusive practices, and co-teaching. And what we found is it was really difficult to kind of put a definition on inclusive education. And then what are inclusive practices? And finally, how does co-teaching fit into all of this? So if you could do, I think it's 3 clicks. So inclusive education is hard, we feel is hard to put a definition on because it's not something concrete. It's a belief system or an approach to education based on the premise that all students should be accepted and valued for their unique abilities. So it's not a thing. It's not something we can put our hands onto. It's a philosophy and a belief system. Inclusive practices then are the strategies or actions used to support, enhance, or develop those inclusive schools. And then you have co-teaching. And co-teaching is a wonderful thing when it's done where teachers have the time to co-plan, co-instruct, and co-assess. It's an amazing thing. But when I first moved to Arkansas, people would say, we do inclusion. And I didn't know what that meant. I'm like, I don't understand that. And what they really meant is we offer co-teaching. And that is fabulous. But in the terms of inclusive education, co-teaching is one inclusive practice. We're going to just briefly touch on a lot of other practices that we could do in our classrooms. Next slide. And go ahead and click. Just keep clicking until you get to additional resources all the way at the bottom. Thank you. So inclusive practices, strategies, or actions. These are several of the things that we're going to be touching on. And again, if you come to that full day training, we'll do a deep dive into each of these. But we're going to talk about least dangerous assumption and executive functioning. We kind of touched on selecting essential standards. We're going to just briefly talk about high leverage practices, universal design for learning. We're going to go over a decision flow chart. We're going to talk about special education being a service and not a place. We're going to review briefly a schedule and then a couple of other resources. Again, we're just touching on each one of these just to kind of show you that they're out there. Next slide, please. And another click. And another click. Sorry, this is hard when you're not clicking yourself. So if you're familiar with this book at all, you're probably familiar with the purple one, and the green one is here just because that's a second edition. So if you're looking to purchase this book now, you will probably get the green edition. That's the most recent one. So you see that the high leverage practices are 22 instructional practices that benefit inclusive education. And you can see I have them broken down into the 22 strategies. So the first 3 are about a collaboration, the next are about assessment, and so forth. But what we feel like is this movement, this inclusive education movement, cannot happen unless we break down those silos and have true collaboration. And we think that the high leverage practices are an excellent place to start focusing those conversations. None of the 22 practices are probably anything new to you, but what they do is they bring intention and focus to that conversation between your general educators and your special educators. Next slide, please. And again. Now, this is another video, and I want you to pay attention. Well, pay attention to the whole video, of course, but the last couple seconds, there's a couple of words that come across the screen, and we're going to talk about it in a moment.
I saw the love across the memories. I seemed so far. I was blind to I was lost at sea until you came along.
That is a pretty amazing video. And next slide, please. What we feel it does is, so if you notice the words, it said 4.38 seconds apart. It's the only difference between us. How powerful of a message is that of those twins who the only difference between them is that they were born 4.38 seconds apart. We feel that that video in its short little clip exemplifies the idea of least dangerous assumption. And if you've never heard about it, the definition is on the screen and you can read that. But really what least dangerous assumption is about, to me, is about having the highest expectations for all students. Because when we have low expectations for students, where are our students going to reach? They're going to reach wherever we set that bar. But if we have high expectations for them, even if they don't reach as high as we have, aren't they still going to reach higher than where the low bar was? So least dangerous assumption is presuming competence in our students and holding them to those highest expectations. And then if we need to accommodate or modify a little bit, that's okay. But they've achieved so much more by having those high expectations. And we feel that that video that we just showed you, the family, the coaches, and the brothers themselves really had the least dangerous assumption in mind when they thought the only difference was the fact that they were born 4.38 seconds apart. Next slide, please. So going down that list from like that first couple of slides where it just kind of gave all the different types of inclusive practices, we really can't have this conversation without talking about executive functioning. Now, executive functioning is huge, and this is a super simplistic view of it. But if you read this definition on the screen, I would bet that anybody in this presentation right now would have to say that they have an executive functioning deficit. And then I feel like you would also say that you have a coping mechanism that you've created, a tool, if you will, that you've put in your belt to be able to work around this deficit so that you can be where you are today. The same can be said about our students, but they probably don't have the tools in their tool belt yet. So if executive functioning is what's blocking them from accessing that learning because they don't have the tools yet to work around that deficit, we need to help them with that. Next slide, please. And 3 clicks, if you will. So executive functioning, again, remember I said it was a really simple view. If we think about it as working memory, the ability to keep information in the mind and then use it. So does anybody ever, somebody tells you, okay, hey, here's my address, and then you go to that place, you have the address in your head on the text and you have to remember it to put it in your GPS, and then you realize you can't remember it and you have to write it down. That's working memory. It's your ability to put something in your head and then recall it to use it. My working memory is not very good. And then you have cognitive flexibility. That's the ability to think about something in more than one way. So maybe you have some students who are really rigid and it might just be a flop in the schedule, or maybe it's a fire drill that was unexpected or something happens. And that one thing could totally turn your student's day upside down. And then they're no longer able to access that learning. And then that third bucket, inhibitory control, the ability to ignore distractions and resist temptations. Anybody have any problems with ADHD in their classrooms? I feel like maybe we all have students in our classrooms who struggle with this bucket a little bit. And we have to understand that, well, I'll tell you a story about myself. When I'm presenting, I pace a lot. And if you come to the full day training, don't give away that little secret until I ask for it. But I was presenting and I stopped pacing, because you'll notice I talk with my hands right now. If I stopped pacing or stopped talking with my hands, I can no longer think, because for me, I have to move to be able to think. So how many times do we have students in our classrooms where we're like, sit down, don't move, stop tapping, do whatever it is. And then that student is focusing all of their cognitive load on stop moving, stop tapping, stop fidgeting, and they can't access the learning because that's all they're thinking about. So how can we help them learn to move, just kind of sway back and forth, or use a quiet fidget, or whatever it may be? What tool can we help them learn so that they can work around their deficits, so then they can access that wonderful learning that you provide them? Next slide, please. So John Hattie, we mentioned him previously, but he is a researcher of research, and he's studied 252 influential factors on student outcomes, student growth. And collective teacher efficacy is the highest one out of all 252, and it comes in at 1.57. The idea of collective teacher efficacy is more than just teacher efficacy, is the fact that I believe I can make a difference for my students. But collective teacher efficacy really drives home that point of collaboration, because collective teacher efficacy is the idea that we together can make a positive difference for all of our students. It's not you versus me or you plus me, it's all of us together. And if we truly have that belief in our school systems, it has the highest effect size, the highest drive of growth for students out of all 252 influential factors. Go ahead to the next slide, if you will. And we're not going to click on this because you guys, everybody has an access to this slide deck, right? Kristen, can you just dump that link in the chat box one more time in case people came in late and they need it? But this is a live link, and it will take you to, there's a full executive functioning training going around the state that ADE is putting on right now. So if executive functioning is something you want to know more about, I think there's 4 or 5 sessions left going around at some co-ops, and there might still be some spots available if that's something you'd like to look into. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about UDL, and I noticed that there's a Universal Design for Learning session next week at 2 p.m. That is super exciting. I might have to try to sit in on that one. So we're not going to dive into it deep. Again, all of these are just kind of overviews. But if you're not familiar with the UDL principles or the UDL framework, this is what it looks like. And it's pretty obvious to see that it's organized by color. So you can look vertically and you'll see provides multiple means of engagement is green, representation is purple, and action and expression is blue. If you could do one click, please. So provide multiple means of engagement is how can we get students to engage in whatever we're teaching them, and how can we keep them engaged? So that's what that first green column really seeks to answer. Next click, please. The purple column, on the other hand, talks about how can content be presented to the students? So maybe you're going to watch, we've watched a lot of videos today, right? Maybe you're going to provide it in a video. Maybe we're going to allow the option to read a text, whatever that is. How can we provide the information so that it's accessible to all students? And then that last column, another click, please. How can students show what they have learned or can do? I have a friend who's an English teacher who talks about, I always have my kiddos do 5-paragraph essays. The standard was not to write an essay, but for some reason, that was the only way that she ever had her kids show what they know. So how can we think outside of that box and harness students' potential in allowing them to show us what they know? Okay, next slide, please. Now, if you could do 2 clicks, one more, please. Thank you. So you'll notice that we can also, not just vertically, but this chart can be read horizontally. So you'll see that first first row has to do with accessing. So for the students to access the learning, we need to recruit their interest, We need to provide options for perception, and we need to provide options for physical action. If we can do all of those, then we're providing them access to the learning that we want them to do. 2 more clicks, please. That middle column is working on building the knowledge. So to be able to build knowledge, you have to sustain effort and persistence. You have to have the language and the symbols to be able to pull that information off of the page or whatever it's on. And then you have to have the ability to express and communicate so that you can build on that. And then that last column, again, 2 more clicks, is I can't read that word. It's really small. Internalize, sorry. It was really small. Is we need them to be able to self-regulate, and that has to do with the executive functioning that we already talked about. And then provide options for comprehension. They need to have that time to be able to process it in their heads. And some students are going to be able to do that on the fly, and other kiddos are just going to need a little bit more time in different ways. And then finally, that last column is about executive functioning. But if you look all the way down bottom, the ultimate goal of universal design for learning is not about the teachers. Another click, please. It's about the students, and it's about students being expert learners. Now, if you are learning something, you may know about yourself that you need to hear it or you need to see it. If I'm reading something, I need to be able to write all over that book. So if I'm really learning something in a text, I actually need to buy the book because I need to write all over it, or else I'm never going to remember anything. I know that about myself because I am an expert learner. Our students don't yet know that about themselves. So that is the responsibility of us as educators to help them learn what makes them an expert learner about themselves. Next slide, please. This slide is just up here. It takes you to the UDL guidelines. But again, I'm not going to go into that, A, because we don't have time, and B, because you have a whole presentation next week on it. But you can go to those UDL guidelines at cas.org, and you'll see the same exact graphic organizer that we just looked at. But you'll notice that each one of those little checkpoints, the little black things with words after them, those are called checkpoints. And each one is a live link and will take you into a deeper level of information. Not a lot of people know that piece. Thank you for doing that. All right. So why does UDL matter, and why does it matter in occlusive education? If it's okay, I'd like you to click on the green box. Let's see if we can do this. Perfect. Thank you. So this is just a lesson. It's kind of a lesson that you might give your students. It's got the lesson, it's got the standard, it has the poem. This happens to be a poem about mother to son by Langston Hughes. And then it has some think about it questions. And then if you go to that next page, it has comprehension questions. I'm going to tell myself and say, this is probably a lesson I would have given my students when I was teaching. Now, if you could go back and click on the blue, we're done with this one. Yes, ma'am. Now, this is a lesson. This is a lesson that's not working right now. Okay, there we go. Now it's working. This is that same lesson, but if I can coin the term UDLified, this lesson has been kind of UDLified. What it's done is it's taken that just kind of standard black and white paper lesson, and it's put principles of universal design for learning into it. So you'll notice in that first section, first of all, you notice it's just more visually appealing. We've added in that first one, the students have different options to be able to access the poem. We'll always give them that written copy, but now they have the option to hear it. Maybe it's text to speech, maybe it's Viola Davis, maybe it's Dr. Martin Luther King. And then in that second section, they have those same think about it questions. And you'll notice there's a little speaker there, and that speaker will read those words if the student's unable to read it, to decode the words. Now, if we are providing this as a lesson and our students are unable to decode, we need to make sure that we're meeting that need at a later point. Then that third section is allowing the students to share their thoughts, and there's many different ways for them to do that. And then that fourth section is that graded assignment. But again, this is offering them multiple options to be able to show us what they know. We will do a full-blown activity with this if it's something you're interested in. We'll do that in a different presentation. But this is just, I'm just showing these two things to highlight what a difference implementing the principles of UDL into your lesson can really make for a student. Now, we're not saying that you should jump in and do every single thing all at once. Any research that we've done on UDL, and I'm sure you'll learn about this more in the presentation next week, says start small. Start with one column, one box, one checkpoint if you need to, and then just build from there. Okay, back to the slide deck if you don't mind. And you can skip that next slide. Thank you. So remember in the beginning of the presentation, I had said one of the biggest questions we get is about, do you mean every student? And we really do mean every student. So this is a video about a young lady named Ashley. And a couple of things about this video. One, you're going to notice that the teacher utilizes the principles of universal design for learning in her 8th grade science class. The other thing you're going to notice is that Ashley is in that 8th grade science class. So can we take a moment and watch this video, please?
When I'm planning for a lesson, I try to give my students multiple access points. This involves different ways of visualizing the material. I know some students learn better by reading, so I make sure that there's an element of reading in there. Some students will learn better if they write it afterwards. Some students need to see it. Some students need to touch it. Sometimes it may feel like a circus, but it's trying to meet the needs of every student in the class.
You will be getting a circle magnet to hold the train or bus onto the Newton scale. This is a new piece of equipment you're going to learn to use. What it does is measure force.
I've worked with Ashley for 2 years now. I taught her in 7th grade science and now in 8th grade science. It was difficult for her to learn how to use the eye gaze machine. Once we started doing that, I started making notebook files so she can look at and switch between the screens. The eye gaze has definitely helped her to become more a part of the class.
I want you to write a question for Ashley. I want you to, okay, I'm going to give you a marker. We need to try to help her figure out if the new ramp is going to have more or less. So will the new ramp have more or less effort? A or B or less?
I'm not sure what the answer is.
She'll work with her peers and she will also be able to go around to different lab stations. So she is capable of learning grade level content as it's relevant. Having students like Ashley with severe disabilities in my classroom benefits every student because they see what the real world is like. They're going to be out in society with people who have different challenges than them. But the more that you are exposed to people with different challenges, different disabilities, the more you're able to show compassion and to help each other out.
That is an opinion that Daniel gets to
You
share.
can close that now. Thank you.
I feel great when we're all reading.
Thanks. So that video about Ashley, just for some people who are struggling with trying to figure out, does every mean all? This is a great video that you can help start that conversation with. The other thing about this video, like we said in the beginning, is it really does show that the teacher is implementing the universal design for learning principles, and all of her students, if you notice in the video, seem to be very, very engaged in that lesson. The next slide talks about, again, that collective teacher efficacy, but it also brings in collaboration because this cannot happen alone. If you think back to Ashley's general education teacher was in that video and she was doing amazing things, but she didn't do it alone. There has to be collaboration between, in that case, Ashley's general education teacher, her special education teacher, there was a paraprofessional, probably her speech therapist, her OT therapist, her physical therapist. All of these people work together so that Ashley could have access to instruction in the general education setting with her peers in her least restrictive environment. Next slide, please. Now we know that behavior is crazy important. What we're not sure that everybody knows about is Arkansas has behavior specialists for our state. And if you go to arbss.org, they have a behavior website, and on their websites, they have these things called behavior breaks. And these behavior breaks are 35-minute or less clips that target specific behavior things. Maybe it's the incredible 5-point scale, or conducting a functional behavior assessment, or building positive support, whatever it might be. But there's one specific one on here. It's called reading the room. And it's a strategy that helps. So if you have students who just kind of walk in and their behavior is not matching the behavior in the classroom, this video, you watch it as a teacher, you learn that strategy, and then you work with the student to teach them the strategy so that they can match their behavior to the room by reading it when they first walk in. That's just one example of all of those great behavior breaks. If this is something you don't know about, come back to this slide deck, go to arbss.org and check them out. There's something for everybody. If you're struggling with something behaviorally in your classroom, this is a great place to look for resources. Next slide, please. All right, and if you click, okay, there you go. So what I'm going to do now is all of these are not truths, but we have seen every one of these on social media. And if you stop right there for a second, we have seen every single one of these on social media. The state's doing away with resource. All students will be co-taught. We're only providing inclusion. No students will be in self-contained. We're doing away with that. Special education teachers, sorry, you're going to have to find another job, just no longer needed. But on the reverse of that, special education teachers, you're now the most highly sought after person. We need you more than anybody else. Minutes, they're based on a bell schedule. I will tell you, every single IEP I wrote was 5 minutes, 50 minutes, 5 times a week, because that's what my bell schedule was. This is harmful to other students. And if a child is receiving special services, they cannot be included in RTI process. One more click, please. So we just want to be clear that every single one of these are myths. And if you could help us in being mythbusters, we would love that. If you hear any of these things, they're just not true. And if you know any that you think we should add to our list, we'd love to hear that too. Okay, the next slide. And one more click, please. So many of you have probably already heard of the phrase core plus more. And you've probably picked up by now that for core, we really mean core instruction in the general education classroom provided by that content teacher. And then plus more. What does that more mean? The next slide, please. So more really means specially designed instruction in this case. That's supplementary services. What does the student need to be able to access that great core instruction? Specially designed instruction, but what does that mean? Well, if we go to IDEA, we see that special education means specially designed instruction, and that specially designed instruction means adapting as appropriate the content, methodology, or delivery instruction to address the unique needs of the child and to ensure that that child has access to the general education curriculum. So special education and that supplementary services, according to IDEA, is in place to ensure that the student can access that general education curriculum. And the people who are your experts at doing that are your general education teachers. Okay, next slide, please. I think there's going to be one that clicks it. Sorry. Okay, again. Do you mind going to this one? Thanks. So this is a decision flow chart, and we came out with it a couple months ago. And again, you have it in the slide deck if that's something you'd like. But when I was just as a teacher, when I was determining least restrictive environment, I really started about 3/4 of the way down this chart with that yellow box, because if it was a special education student, 9 times out of 10, they were going to the resource room for core instruction. And then we would figure out, okay, they're here. Now how long? Well, I already told you, 5 times 50 minutes. And then what? Well, if we look at this decision flow chart and follow it, it starts with the student's needs first. You identify and evaluate the student's needs. Then you identify the goals to address those critical needs. And then for each goal, you identify services and supports that can help support that goal. And then finally, you think about location, but it's only after you've done each of those other things. And then you'll notice when you think about location, there's so many things to consider. If the student can, if we can create specially designed instruction using supplementary aids and services, accommodations, and assistive technology, can the student access and participate in the general education curriculum? If they can, then core instruction should happen in that general education setting. If not, go down to that next box. And in this case, we're going to add the addition of in-classroom support to those supplementary aids and services, accommodations, and assistive technology. And if the student can access and participate in the general education curriculum, then you've got core instruction in the general education setting. And you can see they each build on that until you get down to the bottom and it says, even using all of these things, even with the addition of modifications, that last box, think of Ashley's, the video we just watched. If they cannot, then we're going to finally consider special education, especially designed instruction of the general education curriculum in the special education setting. But remember, there's an asterisk there, because remember, at some point in the future, high school students on the regular pathway to graduation will receive instruction from teachers who are licensed in content areas in order to receive credit towards graduation. That goes back to that timeline. So when we're making the conscious decision to have instruction provided in the special education setting, core instruction, I'm sorry, provided in the special education setting, there are times where that's absolutely that appropriate, but we just have to think about what the outcomes are for our students if that's the option we choose. Next slide, please. Or back to the slide deck, I guess. So we often hear, well, we're going to need more staff. We do have an inclusive practice project, and it's been put into place 3 years now. We have lots of schools that have worked through it, maybe 15 at this point. And we have found that they do not need to increase special education staff, because what they're doing is they're rethinking how to use the current staff that they have. And that's what we're going to do now, is we're going to look at possible scenarios on how to reimagine the special education staff that you currently have. So if you could click again. And there's going to be a lot of clicks, and I apologize because I didn't know you were clicking. So click 2 clicks. You'll see, for those of you who are, I don't know who's here in this audience, and I apologize for that. If you are not special education, this is what the schedule of services looks like on our IEP. And what we have to do is we're responsible at that IEP meeting to fill out that top part. And then in the bottom part, we're responsible for addressing the LRE, the least restrictive environment. Next slide, please. So this is exactly what it looks like. 2 clicks. This is exactly what it looks like. And we would determine a continuum of placement and do one of those check boxes. And then we determine the amount of time in the general education setting, learning alongside their peers. And that's always a percentage of the day. So we'll talk about that. One more click and another click. And this last section we're going to look at is the consideration of special factors. And that's on the page that has like accommodations or assistive technology. It's on that page and it's down bottom. And this is the box that says consideration of special factors. We'll be referring back to this box as well. Next page, please. So that consideration of special factors talks about supplementary aids and services. And this slide just explains that the term supplementary aids and services means aids, services, and other supports that are provided in regular education classes or other education-related settings to enable children with disabilities to be educated with non-disabled students to the maximum extent appropriate. So just keep that in mind as we're talking about these supplementary aids and services. Click, please. the rest of the time, we're going to be going over these scenarios. We're going to have Mr. Goodbook, and you need to know that any student in any of these scenarios that is green are students who have an IEP. So if they're a green student, they have an IEP. So in this scenario, Mr. Goodbook and Miss Smiley co-teach each day in a 50-minute literacy class. They co-plan, co-instruct, and co-assess for the class. They're equal partners. So you probably all have this type of situation in your schools. This is classic co-teaching. This is the only scenario that is co-teaching. Next slide. And click. Keep clicking. And again, and again, and again, and again. There you go. So on your IEP, you would document it as co-teaching services. You could document it as 50 minutes, or you could document it 25. It's just up to how your district does it. You do it 5 times a week, regular classroom, and it does not count on LRE because the students are in the regular education classroom learning beside their general education peers. Next slide, please. This one, Miss Friendly, the special education, and if you could click 3 times, maybe once. There you go, sorry. Miss Friendly, special education teacher, provides special education services for 3 students for 20 minutes every day in the general education literacy classroom. The 3 students are grouped together for specially designed instruction because they have like skill deficits. So you'll notice Miss Friendly's just in the back of the room and she's pulled these 3 students. This probably would not work in a middle school or a high school because students don't want to be identified and pulled back. But if you're in a K2 school where you're pulling small groups all the time, this is not a big deal at all. The thing I really like about this scenario is that there's no lost transition time for students because Miss Friendly is going to them. So there's no walking in the halls. There's none of that. She's going to them, working with them, and then they're going straight back. Now, when that's happening, Mr. Goodbook, the teacher, is not teaching essential standards because our students can't be missing that. The other thing about this slide, you'll notice there's still 1 green student up in the classroom. And that's because although that student has an IEP, they don't have the skill deficit that Miss Friendly is working on right now. So that student's not being pulled back because that student doesn't need the services that Miss Friendly is providing for that specific skill deficit. Okay, next, click please. And thank you. And so you get to the bottom, you'll be right there. So this is one way to possibly document it. Direct instruction and literacy, 20 minutes, 5 times a week in the regular education classroom. Now, in this case, it does count against the least restrictive environment because those students that are being pulled to the back table are only students with IEPs. There's no general education students in that group. So that's why it would count in this case. If you could click again. This is just a different, and again, your 5 clicks. This is just a different way that you could possibly document it. You could put other and small group in the regular classroom. And then 20 minutes, 5 times a week, regular classroom, it still counts as for the LRE. Now this one, Miss Friendly, I think it's one more click, please. Miss Friendly provides extra support for students who need it for 20 minutes every day in the general education literacy classroom. The group is fluid and may change on a daily basis. You'll notice in this scenario, there's only 1 green student today. And tomorrow there might be 2, and the next day there might be 4. Because these groups are pulled based on the needs, the needs that are happening in that moment that day. From Miss Friendly. Miss Friendly is a special education teacher, but she is able, if she's paid out of state and local funds, she is able to work with mixed groups of students. So that's what's allowing her to work with the students in this group right now. Now, how will we document that on the IEP? If you could do a click. It's really not, that's okay. It's really not going to fit here because we don't know at the time that we're making this IEP what students are going to need time with Miss Friendly because we don't know what the teacher is going to be teaching any particular day. So if we want something on the schedule of services, we could put C supplementary aids and services. And then if you'd go to that next slide and one more click, we could put it here Under supplementary aids and services, yes. And then the explanation could be the special education teacher will provide support in the general education literacy class each day. So this is just kind of thinking differently, right? And that's all these scenarios are. They're getting us to think differently. Next slide, please. And click. Again, there should be 4 students total. There we go. Thank you. Miss Friendly serves 4 students with IEPs in her classroom 3 days each week for 25 minutes. The students are grouped together for specially designed instruction because they have like skill deficits. So you'll notice these kiddos are coming from different classrooms and they're going to Miss Friendly, but it's not every day and it's not for a full class period. It's 3 days a week, it's 25 minutes, and they're working on skill deficits. This kind of looks like your speech therapy model, right? So let's see how to document that. Next slide. Direct instruction and literacy, 25 minutes, 3 times a week in the special education classroom, because she's removing them this time. And that does count on against your LRE because we are removing them from their general education peers. Okay, this one, next slide, please. So Mr. Watson is a duly certified teacher. He's licensed in 9-12 mathematics and has recently added his special education endorsement. So this is the program that's being put out by the state right now, that if you're a general education teacher, you can go back to school for 1 year at the state's expense and get a special education resource endorsement in your certification area. If you're a special education teacher, there are certain praxis exams that you can take to test into different areas. And there's the state offers free tutoring for those praxis exams. Back to Mr. Watson. His new skills equip him to provide special education in multiple settings, including the general education classroom. So you'll notice Mr. Watson here, his classroom, he has, I think, three students with IEPs. It's not overloaded because that's really not fair. We want our all students to learn from their peers, right? So he's got about 3 students. He's providing core instruction. Now, if you could go to the next slide, please. But in his class, he also has Victoria, and Victoria has a specific learning disability in math. And as our IEP team develops her annual IEP, they look at her progress in current resources services and decide, you know what? We have a duly certified teacher now, Mr. Watson, and we think that Victoria would do fantastic in this classroom. Next slide, please. And one more. There you go. So you could document this. Direct instruction in math, 50 minutes, 5 times a week, regular classroom. That kind of that classic, right? She's in the classroom with her peers. He's teaching 50 minutes a week. And then it would be no on the LRE because there's general education peers. Now, this scenario in our office, we argued and argued and argued on trying to come up with how to do it. So we don't have one way. We have lots of ways. Really, what's important is that your parents and your teachers understand what the expectation is for this student. Next clip, please. And again, there you go. You could put direct instruction in math, 400 minutes a quarter, regular classroom, doesn't count against your LRE. Again, maybe you want to do 10 periods once a month. It doesn't matter. Whatever works for you, as long as it's clear to everybody. Next click. This, again, there you go. Whoops. Yeah, right there. So this one, what if you don't want to put it exactly? You want to put, say, see supplementary aids and services, and then one more click, and you'll see, yes, supplementary aids and services. The duly certified math teacher will provide supports to Victoria in the general education classroom. This is completely an option, but know that if you put this on the IEP and Mr. Watson goes someplace else and you do not have another duly certified teacher in math, then you're going to have to reconvene that IEP team to look at Victoria's IEP and figure out how you can meet her needs. Next scenario, please. Mr. Franks floats, and one more click. Mr. Franks, he's floating in and out of these classrooms based on student needs. Now, this is a fabulous out of the box way to think about using a special education teacher, but it's not going to work if you don't have strong collaborative teams and if Mr. Franks is not part of those teams. Because if he's not part of that conversation, how does he know where he belongs? How does he know what student needs him? And how does he know when that student needs him? Go ahead and click. Again, there's no set time for this, so we don't think it would go on the special services. We think it would go, next page, please. We think it would go under supplementary aids and services. And another one. Another one. There you go. And one more. The special education teacher will provide support to the general education literacy classroom as Joey's data indicates is needed. We don't want to put just as needed because who determines that? But this is very specific that Joey's data is going to make this determination of when Mr. Frank floats into that classroom to help. Okay, next scenario, please. This one discusses peer-assisted learning strategies. And peer-assisted learning strategies is the idea of, it's a program that we put students through to help them learn how to be peer mentors. We're not just saying take student A and throw them with student B. We're training students so that they then can assist their peers in this learning. The thing about it is that the students who are being the teachers or the assistants, if you will, they know the content so much more deeply because now they're entrusted with teaching it. And if I have to teach something, I'm going to know it because that responsibility I really take seriously. So I know that content strong and inside and out if I'm going to have the responsibility of teaching it to my peers. Next, let's slide. There you go. So this could be put on supplementary aids and services. Peer-assisted learning strategies are utilized to meet Anita's needs. Simple put. Therefore, the parents know that the expectation is, and this district knows what the expectations are. All right. Next slide. Let's meet Gloria. Gloria is a 7th grade student who has an SLD in basic reading. As her IEP team develops her annual review, they look at her progress in current services. They find that she is missing key decoding skills, next click, in order to be able to read grade level text. Her listening comprehension is above average, but she struggles with phonics. So she's in 7th grade and she's struggling with phonics. Let's look at how that could look. Go ahead to the next click. So Ms. Friendly provides in-classroom supports for students in Mr. Goodbook's literacy class. She provides 25 minutes each day. This is not co-teaching because they're not co-planning, co-instructing, and co-assessing. Mrs. Friendly is in that classroom to support these students. Maybe she's helping with accommodations. Maybe she's helping with whatever, setting up assistive technology, whatever it is that these students need, she's pushing in for 25 minutes a day to help with that. And you'll notice that Gloria is one of these students. Next slide, please. And some clicks. So we could put other in classroom supports, 25 minutes, 5 times a week, regular classroom, and it does not count against LRE because Gloria is in there with her peers. Next slide. You could also possibly put it under supplementary aids and services. The special education teacher will provide in-classroom support for 20 minutes each day. Again, it's just about being clear. Okay, next slide, please. And click. Keep going. There you go. Ms. Friendly serves 4 students with IEPs in her classroom 3 days a week for 20 minutes. They work on skill deficits. All students in this group, including Gloria, have skill deficits and specific phonics skills. So Gloria was getting in-classroom support so that she could access the grade level content, but she's also has to be taught phonics. And this is where she's receiving that pull-out instruction. Next slide, please. So we have direct instruction in literacy, 20 minutes, 3 times a week, special education class. And now this counts against the LRE because there's no general education peers. So let's look at that together. Next click. So in this case, Gloria has in-classroom supports and direct instruction in literacy so that we're accessing, we're meeting her needs in both places. Next click. So let's think of this outside of a special education teacher and think about this is in terms of related services. Let's think about our related service providers pushing in. When I was teaching, our speech therapists and our physical therapists and our OTs, they pushed into our classrooms all the time. It made good sense the way that we did it. It worked for our students to be, for our related service providers, our physical therapists to be in gym class, for example. It just worked for us that way. Next slide. And some clicks. So if this might be an example, the student is going to receive speech, 15 minutes, 4 times a week, and it's going to be an other setting. It's flexible. It's in classroom or a nearby location. And again, this would count for LRE because we're polling that student. The student's not near, if it's in a nearby location, they're not going to be with their peers. Okay, next slide, please. Another click. So this one, it just does it in hourly chunks instead of weekly minutes. So it's three hours a month. And that gives your related service provider a little bit more flexibility in how and when they want to meet the needs of the students. Okay, next slide, please. And click. Ms. Friendly meets with these students every Monday for 40 minutes. She pre-teaches concepts and vocabulary. She also reviews previously taught skills. These 4 students have language and working memory deficits. So look at these students, and this is actually happening in Arkansas in a couple of districts. And what they do is these students have the same skill deficits. It's language and working memory. And they pull them on Mondays and front load them for whatever's going to happen in that week, whether it's vocabulary or whatever it may be. This is, again, another model that without true collaboration, how is Ms. Friendly going to know what she needs to work on with these students? So there has to be collaboration happening between Mrs. Friendly and the general education teachers so that she knows how to meet the needs of the students and get them ready for accessing that learning the rest of the week. Next slide, please. So you can see direct instruction and literacy. In this case, it's 40 minutes, 1 time a week, special education classroom, and it does count on the LRE. Next slide, please. And go ahead. There you go. Thanks. Oops. One more forward to the one that says content of the IEP. Perfect. So here you'll see another statement, and it talks about what needs to be in the IEP, because when I was teaching, and when a lot of us are teaching as a special educator, I thought I had to be working directly with my students. If you could go one more click. But you'll notice here, it actually says to be provided to the child or on behalf of the child to be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum. So what does it mean to think about special education or related services offered on behalf of the child? That's what these next 4 scenarios are going to look like. Next slide, please. These next 4, and one more slide. These next 4 scenarios are from this book called Reimagining Special Education, and we do have permission to use them. And they look at the first 3 are facilitators, and then the last one is a consultant teacher. So we're going to just briefly look at what each one of these roles does. Next slide, please. And click. The building level inclusion facilitator, according to Reimagining Special Education, does not work with students. They're a coaching role. They help with accommodations and modifications. They help with job embedded professional learning, instructional strategies, maybe behavior academics. The fact is, this person is working with both general education teachers and special education teachers in the building, facilitating inclusion, but not working directly with students. Next slide. and a click, student-specific inclusions facilitator. So you'll notice this facilitator is assigned to students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. So think about Ashley. So this is going to work in probably larger districts, only because your smaller districts probably wouldn't have enough students to have a need for a separate person. But this facilitator is working with students at Ashley and her team to help facilitate and coordinate all that great stuff that's going to happen so that Ashley can be in that that general education science classroom. And next click. And again, content-specific inclusion facilitator. Again, this probably would be best in a middle school or a high school because generally speaking, your elementary schools don't departmentalize instruction. So maybe you have a special educator who is really strong in English and history or in math and science, and they're going to focus specifically on helping facilitate inclusion for those specific content areas. Again, it's probably going to be a bigger school, but what a great role to help be instrumental in facilitating that inclusion in that 8th grade science class or whatever else it might be. Next slide, please. Now, this one is a consultant teacher. You'll notice he is working with students. So the other 3 were on behalf of students. Now, this consultant teacher is working sometimes with and sometimes on behalf of. Provides some scheduled in-class supports, may work with multiple classrooms. Collaboration has to happen in this case, or else how does he know where he's working or what he's doing, right? He might help with modifying assignments, collecting data, progress reporting, all of those kinds of things. Next slide, please. And click until you get to knowledge of district resources. So if we think about the roles that we just looked at, the facilitator roles and special educators, your special educators are experts in all of these things, right? So what does a facilitator do? Well, a facilitator is going to assist the general educator in providing specially designed instruction. It's going to assist and have a high working knowledge of high leverage practices and universal design for learning, positive behavior supports. They're really going to have the ability to help think about and implement accommodations and then know the difference and implement and think about modifications. They're going to have a very strong working knowledge of all of the disability categories and what and how that might manifest in classrooms. They're going to know about assistive technology. They're going to be able to facilitate collaboration between the adults. They're going to be able to help with data analysis, and they're going to have knowledge of all the resources available in your district. Those are all of the things that these facilitators could have access to and be able to help with. Next slide. We really have to remember that no matter what inclusive practices, we still have to keep in mind that it's about the individual student. So I'm going to give you a moment to read the quote on the slide. Students like Abby should not have to choose between grade level content and improving their reading skills. Just because Abby cannot read on grade level does not mean that she cannot think on grade level. It's pretty powerful. Okay, next slide, please. So now we're just going to touch on scheduling, and we're going to do that with your next slide. Click 3. Yep, one more. So this is how I used. You can keep going. Okay, thanks. 2 more. There you go, right there. The first set of boxes, master schedule created, special education teacher. I was a box on the master schedule. And then my kids with IEPs were plugged into that master schedule. We didn't group them together because they had common skill deficits. We grouped them together because their IEP said 5 times, 50 minutes a week, math instruction. They got given in my classroom. It didn't matter if their deficits were all over the place. That's how they got placed with me. But if we switch that that thought process, and we go to the bottom box and we start with individual student data. And then from that, we think about the supports that are documented, and then we group our students based on common need. We determine who is the best person to provide those supports. And then finally, schedule is developed based on student needs. This we will dive into way more deeper into the next presentation, but this is something to really think about differently. Instead of just saying they have a deficit in math, they need to go to you for core instruction. This is thinking, what are our skill deficits? Who is in the best place to meet those needs of those skill deficits? And then how do we make that scheduling work? Next slide. This is an example of a special education teacher's schedule, kind of building it the way that we just reviewed in that bottom point. Now you notice this is Mr. Porter. And one of the things you probably noticed right off the bat is that Mr. Porter's schedule does not align with the Bell schedule. And that's okay. Mr. Porter does not need to be a box on the master schedule. Mr. Porter's schedule is based around the needs of the students. Next slide, please. And click again. Right there. Mr. Porter does not issue grades. Does your speech therapist issue grades? I don't think so. So if we think about Mr. Porter providing a service, much like your speech therapist, he doesn't offer grades, and he's not tied to a course code, and he's not a box on your master schedule. And then just remembering that he can work with groups of mixed students, students with IEPs and without, if he is paid out of state and local funds. Next slide. We do just want to bring this to your attention. There was a recent due process hearing decision out of Arkansas. So this is like maybe 3 or 4 weeks old at this point. And we'll bring your attention to the bolded text where it says, for most students to comply with this standard, providing FAPE will involve integration in the regular classroom and individualized special education calculated to achieve advancement from grade to grade. So even our hearing officers are grasping onto the idea that integration into the regular education classroom is providing FAPE for these students. So we just wanted to share that most recent hearing officer decision with you. Next slide, please. We're going to go over 2 resources with you that might help with, we've been talking for the last hour about skill deficits, but how do we find those? How do you actually identify what a student specific skill deficit is? Next slide, please. So if you're familiar with the DLM, it's our state's alternate assessment. And if you're familiar with the DLM, you're going to be so valuable in your district to help your general education teachers and your other special education teachers know about this resource because they don't know about it yet. So the DLM, first thing we need to know is it's available for ELA, math, and science, and it's available in grades 3 through 10. Can you click again, please? There you go. Now, one click, please. So it has the grade level standard. You'll see in this case, it's an 8th grade math standard. Next click, it gives you the DLM Essential Element. And what that essential element is the grade level standard reduced in depth, breadth, and complexity. And then another click, and you'll notice that the essential element is broken down into 4 linkage levels. Those 5 linkage levels. And the linkage levels start all the way with the initial precursor, which is the least complex of all the skills. And then it works up another click to the target, which is the one most closely aligned with the essential element. And then it finishes with the successor, which is above the target level. Well, what I really want to bring your attention to is this next slide, because when you go to these mini maps, you'll get to the last page of them and you'll see something like this. And this lists every skill necessary for the student to achieve that essential element. Now, we're not saying that we need to teach all students to essential elements because that's a reduced grade level standard. But we're saying if we use this as a tool for educators to help identify the skill deficits, and we targeted those skill deficits, then we could use it as a resource to close that learning gap. So you could see if our students are in that middle line and they're able to recognize tally charts and line plots and picture graphs, but they're not yet able to choose the appropriate graph given for a set of data, that's a skill deficit. We can target it and we can close that gap. Again, these are available for grades 3 through 10 in math, ELA, and science. Next click. Ohio also has something similar. They're called learning progressions. So they have the learning standard, you'll see there in the blue, and then they have the 3 complexity levels in the red, and then in the gray, they have the learning progressions. And that's a lot like that mini map we just talked about. This one just is kind of built like a ladder, starting with the bottom and working your way up. The reason we present the Ohio learning progressions as well as the DLM is because Ohio is available in kindergarten through 12th grade, and it's available for math, ELA, science, and social studies. So it covers a wider range, but just know that these are Ohio standards and they're similar to Arkansas's, but not exact. But we just want you to know these are 2 resources that are available to all of you right now to help identify skill deficits for all of your students. Next slide, please. Are you okay? Can we play? If you click on that, I think it's going to play. I hope it's going to play a video.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Julie Costin, and today I'm answering the question, what does inclusive education look like? In a story called Because of Oliver. Here is Oliver. He loves being at school with his friends. He is very, very busy. He likes to walk while he learns, and sometimes he hums. Sitting is not his favorite activity, and he really enjoys bouncing. He is fascinated by both insects and trains. He used to be in a room for students who had similar characteristics. His particular room was labeled autism. When he was in that labeled room, it made the hard parts even harder. It was harder to talk with students who struggled to talk. It was harder to make friends with others who struggled to make friends. He could not learn from and make friends with other students in other rooms. And worse yet, students could not learn from and make friends with him. But now Oliver is in a 2nd grade inclusive classroom with 32 students, where lines are not drawn between students. In this classroom, every person is valued for the ways they are different and alike. Oliver's class has 2 teachers, Miss Olaya and Miss Maisel. As you already know, teachers are some of the most creative sort of people. This story is about what happens when these 2 teachers change a lesson, all because of Oliver. This lesson was about parts of a story. The students would learn about character, setting, and plot. The teachers had some plans. They would have the students sit crisscross applesauce on the floor, and Miss Maisel would read a book about a monster under a bed, and Miss Olaya would act out some of the very best parts. Students would raise their hand and answer the questions, and write with a pencil about the plot. They then would each draw the monster from the book. It was going to be a good lesson, but as Oliver's teachers thought about their plan, they realized this lesson might not work for someone who does not like to sit, or can't raise his hand, or answer questions, and does not write with a pencil. Luckily, Oliver's teachers both know about the creative magic of inclusion. They believe when they plan a lesson for their class, they are planning for everyone in their class. So the teachers got together and changed the lesson because of Oliver. They first wrote a list and crossed out what Oliver can't do, and circled what he can do. They took the negative list that came with Oliver, crossed out the negative words, and circled the positive words. From Oliver can't sit to Oliver loves to move. He does not talk to he can point, draw, and smile to communicate. He won't sit still to he works best when standing and bouncing. He does not write to is starting to type on a keyboard. He has trouble starting a task to starts a task with the help of a friend. Focused on trains to is an expert on trains. Obsessed by insects to is an insect scholar. Starting with these circles, the teachers have created access points. Access points are just a student's best way of learning. Now these teachers have almost everything they need to plan their inclusive lesson. Next, they had to change the rules of the lesson. From students must sit crisscross applesauce to students can stand or bounce to listen. Students must raise hands to answer questions to students can point to an answer, tell a friend, or draw their answer. From a student must write with a pencil to students can write with a pencil, a crayon, a marker, or even type. From students must draw the monster in the book to students can create their very own monster using their favorite thing. From students must do things independently to every student can get help from their friends. Let's watch this new lesson in action. When the monster lesson began, Oliver chose to stand just to the side of the teacher. It turns out some students sat on the floor, one sat on a ball and bounced, and several students stood near the back of the rug. Oliver stood and watched as Miss Maisel read the story and Miss Olaya acted out the very best part. Next, it was time for questions. The teacher asked, who were the characters in the story? Most students turned to a friend and said their answer. 3 students drew their answer, and 1 student pointed to an answer and smiled. 2 students needed a reminder not to roll on the carpet, and 1 student needed a reminder not to interrupt. Next, it was time to write the plot. Petra chose a bright green marker, her favorite color. Oliver and Sam both typed their answers in their very favorite font. Chloe used a fresh orange crayon because she loves the smell of new crayons. And Stanley B was the only one who chose to use a pencil, a sharpened number 2 pencil. When the students learned that they could create their own monster, they cheered with delight. However, Oliver did not like the loud noise of the cheering. He covered his ears and began to cry. Trayvon put his hand on Oliver's back and grabbed his noise-blocking headphones and handed them to him. He told Oliver it would be okay. Oliver slowly uncovered his ears and put on his headphones and stopped crying. Oliver did not start making his monster at first, but Aiden reminded him to get started. It turns out Chloe and Daniel both needed reminders from their friends too. Stanley helped Rosie when her glue stick broke. Oliver helped Ellie. He typed the box when Ellie asked him where the glitter was. Oliver bounced and hummed loudly as he worked. Chloe asked him to hum quieter, and he did. Everyone got to use materials from the art table to create their own monster. Rosie's had a baseball bat, arms and legs. Douglas's was pink and wore a superhero cape. Ruthie's looked quite a bit like her new puppy. And Oliver's had, you guessed it, 6 insect legs, a real train body, and a set of feathery antennae. The old lesson was good, but this new lesson turned out to be better, much better. Better for Rosie, Trayvon, Petra, both Stanleys, Sam, Daniel, Ami, Chloe, better for everyone. And this new lesson was much better for Oliver. It turns out this lesson, this class, and this school are all so much better because of Oliver.
All right, if you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So that really, I know that was so super fast and I talked really crazy fast. I'm sorry, I just talk fast naturally. But that really was just kind of a summary and an overview of inclusive practices. If that's something you want to know more about, if you could click on that schedule down bottom link, it's going to open up a link. And this is just going to show you where we're going to be to do kind of a full day presentation on this. So if that's something that you're interested in, I promise you we're coming to a co-op near you. You have a copy of the slide deck. If you have any questions about any of this or just want to talk at any point, I put my email in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to me for anything. I'm here. Again, my name is Tabitha Riendo and I work at the Department of Education in the Special Education Unit. And I think that's okay unless people want to ask questions or whatever. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon.